Section A, Measurement. In this section, we're going to start to prepare for data collection. We're going to start talking about behavior in observable and measurable terms, because that's going to set the foundation for everything that we're going to do in the collection process for a behavioral assessment. If we don't have a well-defined behavior, everything that we're going to do from that point on is going to be skewed. So it's really important that we set a solid foundation of what specifically a behavior is and what qualifies for behavior and what doesn't. So we're going to start to prepare for data collection. We're going to talk about the ABCs of behavior, which when we're talking about ABC stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So it's not that we just focus on the behavior all the time, because that kind of gives us tunnel vision, and it's going to be difficult to determine why a behavior is occurring. So in order to do that, we have to take a look at what the antecedent and what the consequence of the behavior is, which means we have to look at what comes before the behavior and what occurs after the behavior. So we'll talk about that three-term contingency. We'll look at a ABC recording form, and then we'll do some activities that you have to teaches you how to identify what is an antecedent, what is a behavior, and what is a consequence. We'll get into problems with measurement validity, because oftentimes, again, we collect data in order to determine baseline of a client's problem, but also to be able to measure progress over time. So we have to be able to look at different ways of measuring the behavior and what's appropriate way of measuring it for a specific type of behavior. And then one of the things that we'll look at is called inter-observer agreement, which is a way for multiple people to observe the behavior and see how they do in comparison to each other. So this often works when you have a behavior analyst and an RBT working on a case together as part of the role of the behavior analyst supervision, where he or she is going to record the behaviors along with you as an RBT and then see where you're at in comparison, and hopefully that matches up. If it doesn't, then we have to look at, is the behavior poorly defined, or is there additional training required to help the RBT identify what the behavior is that he or she is measuring. So we'll look at advantages and disadvantages of different types of inter-observer agreement. And then we're going to talk about dimensional quantities of behavior, which is really a way of how we measure behavior. Oftentimes we just hear about frequency and duration, but there are other ways of measuring behavior that are a direct form. And then we'll get into an indirect form of measuring behavior and see what that looks like, as far as if you don't have continuous eyes on a client, what are ways that you can measure behavior to determine how the client's doing or how the group is doing when you only have small amounts of time. So we're talking about the difference between continuous and discontinuous measurements. And then we'll get into something called permanent product, which is really a way of measuring behavior when you are not even in the room with the client. And it's actually pretty accurate, and it's only done for certain types of behavior. So we'll talk about that as well. And then once we've gathered all the information as far as the behavior and the different measurements, then we'll talk about how to put that into a graph, because a visual display of data is it's a tool for us to look at behaviors over time and determine progress and effectiveness of the intervention, but it's also a display of behavior for those involved in the treatment process. So for parents and and school officials and whomever is involved in the treatment team, they should be able to look at that without any explanation and make a determination of the course of behavior over time. So we'll talk about the different types of ways of graphing data, and which is best for the behavior that you're looking at. And then finally we'll end it up with talking about different types of ABA terminology that we use. And again, we'll talk about what is a behavior, and we'll look at examples of what isn't a behavior. And then we'll talk about what the importance of the environment is on the behavior. So that's how we're going to do this section here on measurement, and we're going to cover a lot in that time, but it's all going to be important information because, again, it's setting the foundation of everything we're going to be doing once we get into the process of intervention.